What's the nature of your emergency?
Welcome back to the Tactical Living Podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Walton, joined by Sergeant Walton. Clint, how are you?
I'm good.
Today we're going to talk about breaking the cycle and how first responder families can avoid passing down trauma. This isn't really a topic that I hear a lot of people talking about, and I want us of our age, right, to think back to when we grew up in households where like our parents or our grandparents were more likely to have served in the military than in comparison to how things are now, for example. And I'm saying that because I know a lot of friends who are my age who, will discuss things like, oh yeah, my dad was in the military and like I never got to hear any of his stories because he never wanted to talk about it. Or my grandpa, for example. And that seemed to be commonplace. And it's definitely something that has shifted, I think. However, a lot of the times people don't realize that in and of itself, by the non-disclosure of information, can be a creation of passed down trauma, because maybe it was your grandpa and then you hear your dad talking about all of the things that his dad might have experienced during the war. And what happens is we create this imagery, we create this story in our heads of like, the worst of the worst, right? Because it has to be the worst of the worst if you don't want to talk about it at all. And that can create generational trauma. That's just one example.
Yeah, and that really brings me back to thinking about my dad's dad, my grandpa, and he was in the Korean War, and there were times when I found out about his service in the Korean War, I tried picking at him and talking to him about it, and the only response I could ever get out of him is it was just so cold, and you can literally physically see him go back to that time, and that's all he would ever say. It was just so cold. It was just so cold. And it was crazy to see the physical response associated to him going back to that day mentally. And then talking to my dad about it and really hearing like his side of it, because he grew up, in the household, and my grandpa's PTSD response associated to everything when he first got home from the war, and how my dad, being raised in that environment, like it affected him growing up. And he would never say that it did, but you can tell mentally wise, like there was something off there with how my grandpa responded to certain noises, certain things that happened in his life.
Yeah, and it's also important to know that generational trauma is not only something that can impact first responder families or armed service families, but I think that if you work in a high stress or hypervigilant and emotionally demanding culture in terms of the work that you do, this is definitely something that can influence the family dynamics, not only in your immediate family, but also for generations after that, because of what is spoken, what is unspoken, what is seen. Something that's coming to mind for me is somebody that I've worked with, and he is a police officer, and he had made mention to me one time about how one of his boundaries, we'll call it, is that when he and his wife are sleeping in the same bed together, she knows not to like reach over him to grab something while he's sleeping. Yeah,
and it's having those conversations with your spouse or your family members of knowing, okay, it's not that something that you did is causing my emotional response. It's having that conversation, something's affecting that, and that's why.
So let's say that you do have an example of the emotional suppression when it becomes the norm in the household. So an example could be a firefighter father who never talks about the stress of his work so that his kids don't have to deal with that, right? What's really happening is that his kids are actually bottling up that emotion in the same way that he is. And when that happens, then kids especially are going to struggle with processing that emotion in a healthy way. And they're going to grow up and believe that showing your feelings is actually a form of weakness.
Yeah, you're transmuting your emotions, your feelings towards your kids, and because especially kids, they want to learn from their parents, and you're teaching them these negative habits and how to sustain your emotions when if you're holding on to that and not expressing them by any means, and there's a difference between expressing your emotions too much and holding them all in.
Another example of how you might be creating a culture of this generational trauma is through overprotectiveness that creates this sort of fear-based parenting, or even fear-based relationship if you don't have kids. And an example of this is, let's say that you have a police officer who's constantly warning their wife or their kids about the danger of the world. This is going to make them anxious. It's going to make them afraid. And it's very harmful because instead of feeling secure, they're going to develop this sort of hypervigilance in the same way that you do. And they might struggle with things like independence or even decision making. An alternative to that I love seeing is when parents are educating their kids on the importance of self-protection and firearms and firearm safety and having code words in your relationship or in your family dynamics. Like, those are the types of things that make somebody feel empowered even at a very young age.
It's one of those things that we don't think of a lot, is especially being in the first responder realm, we're giving so much training and have so much life experience in how to emotionally handle this stuff and how to respond to these incidents. How much training has your kids or your spouse had in reference to it? Instead of just holding it away from them, train them how they can physically respond to a threat, or to if this then that.
Another example is that when we have a culture of toughness, then what that does is it replaces emotional connection. I'm thinking about somebody whose dad used to always say, like, walk it off, or just shake it off, or, men don't cry, or like that sort of thing. And his dad, his dad was in the military as well. So that was definitely something that was ingrained into that generation, I think. And when that happens, then it can create this sort of feeling of like, my emotions don't matter. And then later on, when they grow into adulthood, they can have a really hard time forming any kind of emotional connection, whether that's with trauma itself or whether that's intimate connections.
Yeah, having that instilled in you, it's adding things onto your tool belt to know how to learn how to healthily deal with these issues.
If you are a person who works in a high stress environment, again, regardless of what it is, if you come home and you're feeling exhausted and you're short-tempered and you're unintentionally taking those emotions out with frustrations on people like your spouse and your kids, this also could be super harmful because it can create this unpredictability in the home environment. And a lot of the times, not only does this create emotional instability for the kids, but I've seen a lot of relationships that, this could even be indicative or lead to other things like volatility or even violence inside of the relationship.
Yeah, if you're holding on to that trauma or those feelings, you need to find methodologies that work for you to express them and not bring them through your door when you come home.
Something else that we might not realize that we do is if you're never discussing any kind of struggles that you're having, let's say that you think you're experiencing some symptoms of CPTSD, then you're leaving your kids or your spouse to wonder why you're so emotionally distant or disengaged all of the time. I'm picturing a person who might be at a family gathering and they're off in a corner playing on their phone instead of being present in the moment, for example.
Yeah, it's you. If you're holding on to that trauma and not addressing it, then you're going to kind of self-remove yourself from that dynamic, and it's not healthy for you, and it's not healthy for your family.
Yeah, and of course, you can be selective about how you choose to share things and what you choose to share and with who, right? But if you're having an outlet, let's say with a confidant, a buddy, a friend, a partner, a priest, like whatever you want, and then you're coming home and you've already gotten that out, then the chances of you carrying that trauma into the household are going to be much more slim. And when we normalize these open conversations about our emotions, then I think it's really beneficial to build this sort of emotional intelligence, not only for ourselves, but for the entire family unit. And something I love about you, Clint, is that you're very great when it comes to setting clear boundaries between your work and your home life. Yeah,
having that decompression stage on your way home or before you even leave the department, it's being able to, what's worked for me is being able to shift from, okay, I'm off of work now, so I shut it off and I can turn it on in an instant, just like I can turn it off in an instant. It's taken a lot of work and a lot of time to be able to do that. And that's why it's important to find those ways of doing it for yourself.
Yeah, and it's also really important for us to do our best when it comes to balancing safety awareness and encouraging independence, whether it's with our kids or with our family or spouse.
Yeah, it's having that heightened sense of awareness of what's going on around you, but not only that, it's explaining to your spouse and your kids of if, and like I said in the beginning, it's teaching them those resiliency techniques of how you can handle a situation when you're presented with it.
I hope you've gotten some value out of today's episode. If you have, do us a favor, drop a review, subscribe down below, and as always, know that I'm sending you a long, tight hug from my home to yours.